Okay, so hi, I'm Nate Berens, and I'm going to be talking about how and why to make your game look crappy on purpose. And that's my dog, who's decided right now to just start making a bunch of noise. Um, yeah, no, this is a joke title. We definitely, people get, um, people sometimes accuse the PS1 or lo-fi aesthetic of being, the product of lazy devs or Unity asset flips or whatever, that kind of thing. So I'm here to talk about kind of like where this style came from, why it's popular, and why it appeals to people, and then also a little bit about how if you're interested in game development, you can kind of get started on achieving that aesthetic in your own work. So, Theo already kind of gave a great introduction, but okay, who am I? Again, I'm Nate Berens. I am an indie developer and an adjunct professor here. I teach, integrated game studio, co-teach, and you'll be seeing their projects after this, actually, immediately after this. So that's exciting. I founded. That sounds so dramatic, but I founded my own little studio, Redact Games, in 2018. For now, it's still just kind of a part-time thing, but it's chugging along, doing pretty well for itself. I've put out a few titles in the last couple of years. Probably the one that has the most people have heard of would be Sagebrush, which is kind of walking simulator lo-fi game about exploring a cult compound that came out a couple of years ago. That's available, on PC and on pretty much every console, actually. Cellular Harvest is a little photography game I made last year in a pretty short time frame. You can kind of see that's the background, the larger picture in the background. It's about exploring an alien world and taking photos of the creatures that you find there. And then I've contributed to the last couple of DreadX collections, which I'll be talking about a little bit more in a bit. But I have a game called Sato Wonderland that is part of the third DreadX collection. And then I built the hub world and launcher for DreadX collection The Hunt, which just came out last week. And then also kind of my long-term project that I've been just picking away at is a retro shooter called Effigy, which is kind of a blend of retro kind of shooter combat with Metroidvania structure, that's still a ways off, but yeah. So that's me. Pretty much everything I've made has been either very much in the PS1 style or adjacent to it, right on the edge of the Venn diagram. And through that, I've had the kind of good fortune to be part of communities that are where a lot of this stuff is coming from. A lot of this interesting work and experimental stuff is being produced. Thankfully, I kind of just stumbled onto being a part of this scene, and I'm as much of a fan of it as I am, making stuff in it. What's up, buddy? I think he wants to go outside. I might let my dog out. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to get to talking about that. But first, I wanted to talk about kind of the lead up to the present kind of 32-bit nostalgia. So obviously, for well over a decade now, kind of one of the ruling aesthetics in indie games, especially, has been this 8-bit or 16-bit nostalgia. Basically right from the beginning of indie games, as far back as like even Cave Story, which is from the original 2003 or something like that. I forget exactly. People have been working in this throwback style. They've been using pixel art, emulating the style of the Nintendo, of the Sega Genesis, of the Super Nintendo, in some cases working very strictly in those limitations and trying to match it as exactly as possible, or like constraining themselves even to color depths and that kind of thing to, really force themselves to use some of those elements, like dithering. Obviously computers today can handle the 16 million colors or beyond that, to handle the gradient and shading, but some of them self limit and use these like dithering patterns because they're attractive. Some games, choose not to stick as closely to that original style, and instead kind of use it as a springboard towards something more evocative of the style. It certainly is recognizable as being, evoking the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis or something like that, but it's clearly not sticking within the technical limits, and it's kind of going and building its own little niche, building off of those styles. And so I have some examples here, and you can see something like The Messenger, which is actually one of the newest games. It's actually the newest game on this list or on this page, but it consciously sticks very closely to kind of the limitations and color palette of an 8-bit kind of game, versus something like Hyperlight Drifter at the bottom, which there's really nothing that came out in the 90s that looked like that. But at the same time, you look at it and you're like, oh, that's playing off of Zelda, absolutely. Like, there's no question. So I just, that's not news to like really anybody here, but I just wanted to say, people for years have been saying, hey, when are we going to hit 32-bit? There was a joke for a long time, like, oh, eventually people are going to get sick of the pixel art and we're going to start getting like, early 3D stuff, PlayStation style, an indie boom of PlayStation style games. And it seems to have happened. But in the same way that the people using this 8-bit and 16-bit nostalgia, in the way that some of them were interested in very accurately recreating it, some of them were interested in just kind of evoking that feel and then doing something new or different, or not necessarily playing within the exact limitations. So within the last, I want to say probably 5 or 6 years, especially, we started to see more people taking a stab at the PlayStation style. And one of here I've just kind of listed some of the early ones, and I'll get to Minecraft. There's an asterisk there. But some of the early pioneers who started playing around with the style of like, hey, what if we could recreate this low poly retro aesthetic in modern engines? You had 98DMake, which he ran a YouTube channel for a long time called 98DMake, where they were not playable games. They were just kind of like little dioramas or little video clips that he would create with low poly versions of everything from Uncharted to Death Stranding, and those became extremely popular, and I think showed it showed people like that there is an attraction to this style and that people really do kind of like. People haven't just forgotten it as the ugly first attempts at 3D, before people learned better. Like there's a pull to that style. 98DMake then went on to make some actual like playable games. OK Normal is one that it is very much in the PS1 style, and then he did some other stuff in a different style. Another early pioneer was Kitty Horror Show. They were really prolific for a few years, just pumping out a lot of very experimental kind of, you could call them walking sims, but they were narrative kind of exploration games, let's say. And a lot of them use this low poly aesthetic that went a little bit more explicitly in the PlayStation, or even just broadly 90s style. So the game pictured here in the bottom left is Anatomy, which is still to this date, I think, one of the scariest games of all time, which is literally just about walking around this little low poly house and finding tapes, and it's terrifying. So they haven't really produced as much recently, but if you are interested, a lot of their stuff is either extremely cheap or free on itch.io, and you should really go check it out because it's fantastic. In that same vein, there was just a lot of there was a growth. This style kind of grew in tandem with the idea of indie horror, of people doing these kind of small horror games developed by either a solo developer or a small team. And so, Kitty Horror Show was working alone. I'm Scared, I believe it was a solo developer. So that was a game that had a very chunky, low resolution style with very low detail, and it used that detail to create this weird ambiguity where you weren't always sure what you were seeing. That came out, I believe, around the same time as Slender, which was obviously this massive, meme viral hit of an indie horror game, but had a very different art style. So I'm Scared kind of took indie horror and said, hey, what if we also consciously we're doing this this throwback aesthetic. Back in 1995 is the one picture in the top left, and that was another. It was a solo Japanese developer, I believe, who released that. It wasn't actually that well received critically, but a lot of if you go back and read previews and stuff, people were really excited about the idea of the style making a comeback. And it did a really nice job of recreating that Silent Hill look. And then I put Minecraft on here, not because Minecraft is made to look like a PlayStation 1 game. It's certainly not, but it went with the kind of unfiltered, raw, chunky pixel look. And I think it did that because it played well with the cute voxels, the nature of the entire, of the world. But in doing so, I think it paved the way for a lot of other people to accept that style. For a lot of fans who played Minecraft because they loved Minecraft, to not immediately shy away from seeing those low resolution textures, or even to come to like that visual style. I think it opened doors basically for other people, even if it wasn't trying to be a consciously retro looking game itself. And so you would see a few of these every once in a while pop out. And usually people are like, wow, it just really looks like an old PlayStation game. That's so neat. But that's all it kind of really ever stayed as. It was this very occasional thing that you would see until I want to say a couple of years ago, and you started to see games kind of break out beyond minor hits. I mean, obviously Minecraft is the biggest game of all time, right? But I don't quite count it in the same. I think it paved the way, but it wasn't. It's not a PS1 style game, right? But these games, I think, kind of broke out beyond, being fun little things that you saw on itch.io or Game Jolt or whatever. Maybe some of those games would get the occasional write-up on a news site, but these did a bit better. They sold more, they got more press coverage, they got more awards, etc. Paratopic was a game that I was working on Sagebrush at the time Paratopic came out. And I remember seeing screenshots and going, well, that's it. They beat me to it. No one's going to want this style anymore. I guess I'll stick with it. I'll see it to the end anyway. And it turns out plenty of people still want something in that visual style. But Paratopic is this really wonderful, surreal horror game. And then, Dusk was not, again, this will come up time and time again, that when I say PlayStation style, sometimes it means PlayStation style, and sometimes it means broadly retro 3D. And that definition means different things to different people. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But a game like Dusk was clearly not trying to look like the original PlayStation. It was trying to look more like something like Quake. The 90s, the mid 90s, early 3D first person shooters. That didn't stop a lot of people from calling it PlayStation style because it all kind of falls into this big blob of chunky pixels basically. But Dusk was a critical hit. It sold really nicely. It spawned a bunch of imitators and basically spawned the retro shooter scene. and certainly helped grow the audience beyond like people making these little tiny experimental horror games. And then Anodyne 2, Anodyne 1 actually had a very it was an indie game made by a couple people that had a very sorry about that. You go. Hey, he's decided to interrupt my talk. Where was I? So Anodyne had a very conscious like 16-bit style that was evoking like Link to the Past and that era. And then Anodyne 2 included some elements of that, and then built on that by adding like these 3D areas that were very consciously like a 32-bit style with low poly geometry and the kind of low resolution textures and that kind of thing. So around this time, communities started to spring up, like fan communities and developer communities. And sometimes, a lot of times, there was overlap between the fan communities and the developer communities, because honestly, a lot of us make this stuff because we. He's unhappy right now. But yeah, a lot of us make this stuff because we want to play it. Around, I want to say, in 2019, a little after Sagebrush came out, I stumbled onto this little Discord channel called Haunted PS1, which at the time was pretty small. It was started by an indie developer named Brogan Hackett, and they just kind of started it for, hey, do you like low poly horror games? Do you like making them? Let's talk about it. And we just met, and we would share builds of our games, and we would share techniques, and we would ping pong feedback on each other's builds and that kind of thing. And then someone had the idea of, hey, do you remember those little demo discs that would always get shipped with magazines, or that you would get like when you bought a new console or something like that would come with 10 or 15 demos. And we were like, yeah, we remember those, because for those of you that aren't old enough to remember, there was a time before the internet was a reliable way to download big files, and the consoles were not connected to the internet, so your only option to try something was either to rent it or play the demo. So demo discs were a huge deal. It was like Christmas when you got a new demo disc. So we decided to jump in and, hey, let's make one of those, but with our stuff, and we'll try to recreate that aesthetic, and it'll just be super fun. And it was literally just an internal passion project. Like, we were thinking maybe a few people would pay attention to it, but it was just something that we would really that we just thought was fun. And then so that was a collaboration from a bunch of Haunted PS1 members. Brogan Hackett, Bryce Butcher, who built like the launcher, Amos Sori, who created the Scully character that kind of became the mascot for the entire ordeal. Anyway, so we put that together and we released it, and it kind of blew up, and we didn't expect that, but it suddenly was getting coverage on pretty much every mainstream gaming site. It was all over Twitch. People were streaming a bunch of it. People were doing write-ups. The download numbers were like insane, and we were completely caught off guard. It was very cool. We weren't mad, but it was surprising. And since then, Haunted PS1 has become a much more crowded, but still like it's become more crowded. It's certainly more popular, but it has, I think, done a great job of staying true to just being this like, it's a developer community, but a community for people who are fans of these types of games, right? Like, it's we were just really kind of into it, and we people just sit around sharing shaders and play testing each other's games and that kind of stuff. And it has stayed like totally non-commercial. People approached us and wanted us to like sell the demo disc and everything. We were kind of like, let's just keep this fun. At the same time, the popularity of Dusk, which was published by a company called New Blood, Um, that kind of helped spearhead this new retro, or not new, but like this growing retro shooter genre, and this fandom on Twitter that really kind of grew up around it. Um, that has now, like, it started with New Blood games, and then become it's grown far beyond it. Excuse me. Um, so now there's a magazine called E1, which is devoted to retro shooters, but also just kind of games in that vein. Realms Deep is a streaming event um, that went on for the first time last year, which was again dedicated to the same kind of thing. And again, it's a developer community who are also all fans of the genre, right? They're like, New Blood, even though they are operating on a level much higher than the rest of us in terms of sales and budget and that kind of thing, routinely just share stuff they think is neat on Twitter and signal boost it and stuff. They're definitely not protective of their own, their ownership of the genre or anything like that. So it's just become this like big, we're all just, hey, that looks cool. Oh, that looks cool. Oh, that looks cool. Oh, that looks cool. And sharing each other's stuff. And that has spread out beyond just developers sharing it into kind of a fan community as well. And then DreadXP is another company that started and still functions as a news site about horror games. But they decided to try and experiment last year and basically fund a game jam, more or less. Like, basically they invited a number of developers from the scene in, and said, hey, we'll work on a game for X number of days, and then we'll put them all together, package them in a launcher, and sell them, and you'll get a cut, that kind of thing. And it was they tried it. They were just like, well, we'll see. If not, it was it wasn't a huge bust. Like, we'll just see how it goes. And again, it proved really, really popular. It proved like a really popular thing to stream on Twitch. It proved to sell quite well. Critics enjoyed it and everything. People kind of embraced the jankier elements of it in a way. And the fact that these were kind of like very kind of purely creative works, because there wasn't really enough time to do more than just kind of just throw this idea out there, and there was just kind of a rawness to it that I think people appreciated. So anyway, the first one was a big success. The second one followed up a few months later and was an even bigger success. And then, I was lucky enough to be invited to be a part of the third one. So I have a game in the third DreadX collection, alongside. We jokingly called that the Haunted PS1 collection, because so many people were pulled in from the Haunted PS1 community into that. And then again, I was invited back for the fourth collection, which again just came out, to build kind of the hub world and then launcher for it. So that's been a lot of my life for the last few months, is working on that, and it's out and people seem to like it, and that's pretty neat. So in a way, like, there's a lot of these are like either horror based or horror adjacent, and there's reasons for that I'll get into a little, but it's not the entire scene, right? There's something like Anodyne is not a horror game, though it has some very surreal elements, but it's not a horror game. And even Haunted PS1 welcomes people who aren't interested in horror, even though it's in the name that it's kind of horror based. The scene is not specifically just horror. It just happens to be that there's a lot of overlap between people who want to make horror or shooters, and people who like this style. But I think as it grows in popularity, I think you're going to see more people branching out and playing with other aesthetics, or playing with other genres and subject matters and that kind of thing. Let's see. Yep. So these are just a couple of examples that I consider to be some of the highlights that have come out of this quote scene. The top left is a game called Fatum Batula. I'm not exactly sure how to say it, by Bryce Butcher, that it had a demo on the first demo disc, and then is now has a full release on Steam and just came out on Switch. In the top right is Dread Delusion, which is by Lovely Hell Place. That's the name it goes by. It's kind of a not quite open world, but kind of a adventure RPG kind of game that also had a demo on the Haunted PS1 demo disc, and then now is being published by DreadX, DreadXP as a full title. So that's in development. Ultra Kill is in the bottom left, which is kind of a mix between, what do they call it? Devil May Quake is the name they've gone with. So kind of a mix of the character action of Devil May Cry with the kind of fast-paced retro shooter style of Quake. And Ultra Kill is interesting because it literally has it toggle options that lets you toggle between PSX style, PlayStation style, or PC style, and it changes some of the resolution and some of the effects that like the texture warping and stuff that I'm going to talk about in a second. But that was one where it sounds like they almost couldn't quite decide whether they wanted to lean more explicitly in the, like, do we want it to look like exactly like a PlayStation game, or do we want it to look more like a PC game? We'll just throw in a toggle and let people decide. And then in the bottom right is a game called Lost in Vivo by a developer goes by Akuma Kira, which is interesting because visually it's far more modern than most of these other games, but it's still very recognizably retro. It has very low resolution textures and that kind of thing, but it brings in some modern touches, like PBR materials and specular lighting and that kind of thing. But in its design philosophy, it is through and through a kind of old school survival horror game. So I've talked a lot about titles in it, but what makes it PS1? So there are elements, again, the running theme here should be basically that it's broad. There are certain things that I think people identify with, this aesthetic, but not every game tries to recreate every part of it equally. Some people are very interested in recreating every little technical limitation or feature of the PlayStation, and plenty of people just kind of like big pixels on their textures. And it's a broad spectrum, but it helps to have kind of a baseline for what people mean when they're talking about like the PlayStation graphical style. And so here are kind of I think the main highlights of what you would call the PS1 style. Actually, ironically, I think they're all demonstrated except for the very bullet point in this screenshot of Metal Gear Solid 1, which is running on an emulator, so it has actually much higher resolution than the original game, but low resolution. Games back then did not run at 1920 by 1080 or 4K. I mean, you were lucky if they ran at 800 by 600 on a PC. Most of them, like the PlayStation, I think it had a few different options for resolution, but you were pretty much working with like a 320 by 240 kind of resolution. And so, right then and there, having a low resolution immediately kind of puts your game in retro 3D territory. Obviously, a low poly count. If you look here, the detail is all in the textures. It's not geometry. So the trim on the walls or like the kind of lattice on the ceiling, it's a flat plane. The detail is all in the texture because they couldn't afford the extra polys. And then obviously Snake himself is by PS1 standards, the Metal Gear Solid characters are quite high poly count. But even so, you can still see all of the angles and and again, a lot of the detail is left to the textures. The next two are kind of, it's nice to put a name to them because they're kind of this I think even when you're a kid, you notice that the PlayStation has this weird wobbliness to it, but you don't always know what what's going on or why that is, or what it's called, certainly. Um, but it's really two effects working together that are idiosyncrasies of the PlayStation's hardware. Um, so the first is affine texture warping, which is basically a cheaper way of mapping a texture to a polygon than perspective correct texture warping. Uh, I don't know the exact details, but suffice to say, it was faster. And when you were working with a machine that was, powerful, but only just powerful enough to do what it was designed to do, you had to be very efficient. And so they decided to cut some corners in places, and one of the ways they did that was to use affine texture warping. What that means, though, is that generally it looks pretty good and the textures are placed on the polygon correctly. But at certain, especially like angles close to perpendicular to the camera, they start to warp. The renderer is trying to place them perspective correct and can't quite get it totally accurately because it's, I believe it's, it has to do with like a rounding issue in the numbers. I am not a complete expert on that, but you can see in the trim on the wall, there's this line going across, and across the back wall, it's completely straight. And on the side walls, you hit this point where it's kind of at a shallow angle to the camera, and it immediately goes zigzaggy. And if you were to move the camera even just a little, that would start to flip around and warp in a very kind of unique way. So that is something that immediately screams PlayStation, even if you don't necessarily know that's what you're. It's almost like when you hear something, you're like, oh, I think that's playing on vinyl. You kind of hear the crackles and pops or something. That's kind of the crackle and pop of the PlayStation. In that same vein, vertex snapping is an issue where, again, a floating point rounding issue where, again, to speed up calculations in 3D, they rounded their floating points to a less accurate degree than other hardware, which meant that you lost some accuracy, which meant that if a vertex moved just a little, on screen, it might actually end up getting rounded and snap over, a unit or something, basically, that wasn't entirely accurate. And so you would get things like in the ground tiles there, you can see in the ground because some of those vertices have snapped kind of into the next position, even though they're technically supposed to be touching the tiles right next to it. So that's where you kind of get, and also you would see it in a lot of like 3D, like in the character models. If the camera was around or if they were moving a little, you would see this kind of like wobbling in their vertices as they moved around, almost like their like shape was like swimming a little bit, and that's the vertex snapping in action. The other thing is per vertex lighting. A lot of things here have to do with like vertices. They weren't done on a per pixel basis; they were done on a per vertex basis because doing some things pixel by pixel was just too expensive for the hardware at the time. So per vertex lighting is lighting where it calculates the lighting at each vertex and then it just kind of fades between them. So if you have a wall like you have here, you can see that there are dark spots along the wall, but it's kind of like fading between one corner and the other, and that's the vertex lighting in action, where it calculates, okay, this corner has this brightness value, this corner has this brightness value, and we'll just do this nice easy fade between them instead of going pixel by pixel and trying to calculate how the light falls on it. Some games didn't even go that far. They basically pre-painted on their lighting, or used vertex painting, where they would assign a kind of an overlay color to a texture on a vertex basis, and you would get that nice fade. You can see that in games like Vagrant Story. They do that incredibly well. Perfect Dark was another example that had a lot of really interesting vertex lighting, vertex painted lighting, because it was basically baked in. You didn't have to calculate light; it wasn't being changed in real time, so it was faster. And if you took the time to do the painting, then you could actually get really, really nice results. And then the number one thing is unfiltered textures. So texture filtering is just, you take the raw texture and it applies kind of an algorithm to it that smooths it out, kind of blurs it a little, hides the chunky pixels. But we like chunky pixels. And so, the PlayStation had no texture filtering. You can see every little pixel on every little texture. And yeah, so those combined are basically the elements of a PlayStation look. That said, I've said a number of times, it was broader than that. Not everyone was trying to recreate that exact look, and there was some more variance on that. So around the same time, you also had other hardware like the Nintendo 64, which did have some texture filtering on it, but it had this weird texture filtering algorithm that was like really identifiable as the N64, and did this anti-aliasing pass to kind of quote smooth things out, but it really just made everything look blurry. The PC at the time was kind of the Wild West. There wasn't really any standard hardware or standard like APIs for the hardware. I think DirectX was like just a thing just then, or OpenGL was still like a baby. And so PC games, there really isn't any one like, oh, that's what a mid-90s PC game looked like. It was all over the place based on what hardware the developers went for to try to support. That said, I think for a lot of people, that iconic mid-90s PC game is like Quake, and so that is kind of the reference point that a lot of people go to when they're trying to build something that evokes that era. And one of the things that sets Quake apart is that it had this like baked lighting algorithm, which is now very common. It's still in use today. The idea of like baking your lighting, but the idea that you would basically run a program, you would build your map, you would place your lights, and then you would run a program that would pre-calculate the path of all the lights and create this second set of textures that would overlay on top of your map that would create shadows and that kind of thing. So they weren't real time; they were baked, and that meant they couldn't really be changed once they were in place. But they looked really nice, and they had these nice gradients, and you could have these really intricate shadows and that kind of thing. The Saturn is interesting. I'm going to glaze over a little bit because Saturn. So I love the Sega Saturn, but one of the reasons, like, it was never that popular. A lot of people don't remember it as fondly as that. Certainly not as many people remember it fondly as do the PlayStation or the N64. But it also had a really interesting architecture where it used two graphics chips in tandem to build its scenes, and it did a lot of things that the industry kind of just went the opposite direction, or chose the other path. So the Saturn rendered in quads instead of tris, which nobody's really done since. I mean, you can use quads, but like really on some deep down, it's two tris that are attached. And then the Saturn needed to use a lot of trickery for things where it would fake 2D. It would fake 3D effects using its 2D graphics chip. And just in general, games, not many people try to make this look, but I think it's an interesting look that I'd like to see some more people tackle. But yeah, I think it'd be even more of a struggle than getting the PlayStation look down. So, in terms of recreating the hardware of that time, even that's not, oh, this is what it looked like. There were obviously a number of different styles that were kind of in parallel. But even then, you have this spectrum in the scene that are between people who are trying to recreate things extremely accurately versus people trying to kind of evoke that era. they want it to feel like that era, but they're not actually trying, you know, look exactly like it. And so on the left, you have these. Actually, a friend from HANA PS1 worked on both of these, Modus Interactive. Like he's kind of part of the side of HANA PS1. Very interested in recreating hardware limitations and the style of the hardware. And so, you know, they make sure to have the texture warping. They make sure to have the vertex lighting. They make sure to have, you know, vertex painted lights. So, like in that bottom left screenshot, the shadows at the top are not calculated lighting. It's painted on, you know, basically. Those vertices are set to be in shadow, and it can look really excellent if you take the time to do it. But you know, other than the fact that yes, the games run at 16:9 resolutions, have mouse and keyboard support. You know, it's not literally PlayStation code, but they go the extra mile in trying to make it look exactly like the historical hardware. In the middle, you have games that again are sticking kind of closely to it, but are not super accurate. I included my own game Sagebrush, which is the top middle screenshot in that category because it people, when they saw it, immediately went, oh, it's PlayStation style. And it clearly identifiably is that. It has the unfiltered textures, it has the low resolution, but it also has things like real-time per pixel lighting that the PlayStation could never do. Where you can kind of see these like smooth gradients on the lighting as it falls off, and real-time shadows when you have the flashlight out. Which in my case was a conscious choice that I didn't want to stick exactly to the PlayStation aesthetic. I wanted to recall that era, but I wanted to have and lights that you could turn off and on and that kind of thing. So, you know, I chose not to stick exactly to it. And then the right, there are games that are even further away from technical accuracy in terms of, you know, 90s hardware, but still clearly are evoking that era. So Lost in Vivo, again, when you play it, it is undeniably that kind of game, right? Like a 90s survival horror style game, but it has, you know, modern materials, modern lighting, and that kind of thing, and a higher detail level than you would see in the PlayStation game. And then bottom right is a game you might have heard of. It's sold a few copies recently, called Valheim, that, you know, has these pixelated textures and has, you know, low poly 3D models and that kind of thing, but otherwise layers on all sorts of post-processing effects and just creates a you know, an environment that's far more dense and expensive computationally than the doesn't stop people in the Steam reviews from going, oh, it looks ugly. So that's all well and good, but why do people like this stuff? Because as I just said, you know, even something that is as kind of gorgeous as Valheim, plenty of people are like, I don't know, it's kind of crappy. It's like all pixely. So certainly it's not for everyone, but why, you know, clearly some people feel very strongly about this style. I do. So why do people like this stuff? Well, the obvious answer is nostalgia. You know, people of a certain age, millennials and Gen Xers, you know, memories of this. You know, this is the stuff I grew up on. You know, when I think back to my fond childhood days, it's of renting a new game for the PlayStation or the N64 and sitting in my basement and, you know, popping the CD in and, you know, just being blown away by the fact that it had actual full motion video in the introduction. Oh my gosh, it's like a movie, that kind of stuff. But even for people who didn't, you know, a lot of Haunted PS1 people, like members, are younger, far younger than the PlayStation. You know, they weren't alive when it first came out, and for them, some of it is just kind of a vintage charm. You know, I think that it's still appealing to people who didn't necessarily grow up with it, or maybe they did grow up with it, where, you know, it was a hand-me-down from their older brother or something like that. But clearly it appeals to plenty of people who kind of quote weren't there originally. In the same way that, you know, I didn't grow up with records being a common thing, but my vinyl collection is growing because I think they're neat. And then there's the quote lazy dev argument, which I hate that. But, you know, like but there's the kernel of truth to it is this style is achievable for people with resources that couldn't do a more detailed style, right? Some of that's skill, some of that is budget, some of that's time. Art is really hard. It takes a lot of time. And when you were making a game by yourself, you also have to do all the code, all the design, all the writing, everything. And so you look for ways to trim the fat, we'll say, not cut corners, because you're still trying to build something that is a, you know, complete and satisfying product, but something that you can actually finish in under a decade. And low poly art is not easy. It's easier than trying to build some like really high poly, mesh and then go into substance and create this PBR material. And, you know, it's certainly quicker than that workflow, but there's an artistry to removing detail while keeping the subject matter like clear and evocative. And then yeah, bad low poly art is actually pretty easy, and sometimes all you need to do is bang out a quick chair and it looks like crap, but you just need a chair, and it's easier to do that. So yeah, there is an element of logistical pragmatism. Like it's quicker and easier to work in this style, and when you don't have a budget to hire an artist or don't have, you know, infinite amounts of time, it's just realistic. And if you do it right, you're not sacrificing attractiveness of the game to do it. But it goes beyond that. It's not just that it's easy. This is kind of a word salad. I'm sorry, but these games, I think the unspoken attraction for a lot of people is not just the visuals, but in working in this visual style, you kind of consciously or unconsciously start bringing out kind of forgotten design philosophies. And some people would call them outdated. You know, they're old games, you know, were, you know, too hard or too, you know, confusing or whatever. But I think some of those have been outdated for long enough now that feel fresh again in a way, where you see it with like the explosion of Souls-like games and that kind of thing, where Dark Souls broke all the rules and people loved it. And this era of games was a time when the rules hadn't been written yet, because 3D was brand new. People had figured out 2D pretty well by that point, but the 3D and having the larger storage media of CD is like, there were no rules, and so everything that you were doing was like the first time it had been done in a game, you know, or it had been done, but you were trying it a little bit differently, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't set in stone. And so you have things like, if you've ever played or heard of the Kingsfield games, Kingsfield is a game from Software, the same company that makes Dark Souls, and in a lot of ways is considered the proto Dark Souls. It was a first-person dungeon crawler that has that the same kind of sense of mystery and awe and everything, but it also has like almost hilariously simple graphics and the worst melee combat you've ever played. But at the same time, there was something to it. Like, I'm not going to recommend it unless you're up for really punishing melee combat. That's really, really, really slow. But there was an interesting, like, they were figuring out 3D world design. You know, there's no waypoints. It doesn't hold your hand in the way that a lot of modern games do. And in fact, I think that's kind of a common thread through a lot of these, is that they were generally a little more trusting of the player than games are these days. A lot of games these days, they want to funnel you to the good stuff, to the content, or make sure that you're spending money on microtransactions or that kind of thing. And I'm not going to say that games today are bad; they don't make like they used to, but there was kind of a blank page when you brought up. So it wasn't really necessarily clear what the limits were. When you played Thief: The Dark Project for the first time, it was like one of the first games to ever say, hey, what if you didn't shoot everybody? What if you hid in the shadows? And like, that was thrilling and freeing in a way that, only seeing something for, like a completely new can be. So I think when you work in this style, you kind of go back to that mindset of like trying to work in this almost Wild West era. I know that sounds really abstract, but I've just noticed it among people working in this style that the games tend to be a little less directed, a little more experimental, but also just more trusting of the player. And then you also have this thing, I said before, like there's so much overlap between this and the horror genre, and I think part of the reason that horror developers go to this style so often is that the ambiguity in the graphics leads the player to fill in gaps with their own imagination, and that's especially like great for horror games, because you're suddenly like, what did I see over there? What was that? I don't know. What was that? And that's something that, as you increase fidelity, certainly gorgeous and amazing with like super modern. Resident Evil Village is going to look fantastic, but there's something about playing Silent Hill 1 and just being like, I'm not totally sure I know what I see off in the shadows, because it was like low poly and grainy, and you kind of had to fill in the gaps with your brain. Okay, well, I'm running a little long, so this is more or less my last slide. How do I make my games look like this in Unity? Certainly you can do it in Unreal or Godot. Here you go. Now he's going nuts on the couch. My dog loves me. So in Unity, this is what I'm familiar with. This is what I can speak to. Here you go. Oh. Check out the Haunted PSX render pipeline. It's by a guy who's actually, I didn't even know this until I looked it up, even though I kind of know the guy. He's a graphics programmer at Unity, and he built basically a scriptable pipeline for Unity that fully, like it basically has every feature that I talked about. Everything, like it's not quite plug and play. There's a little bit of setup you have to do just to get it working as a scriptable pipeline. But once you do, you're pretty much just checking boxes on and off. It's like, I want affine texture warping on. I want vertex snapping on. Here's a little slider to control how strong it is. And it's free, it's open source, and I've used it for projects. A lot of 100PS1 people, it's become a mainstay of their projects because it is just so nice to get it up and running. That said, you can go piece by piece through it. The biggest thing is to just turn off texture filtering, and then a lot of the other stuff happens through shaders, which I'm obviously not going to get to. How to write your own vertex shaders in this time frame, but hopefully now that you know the terms, you can at least start Googling and either find shaders that do it for you, or find the path towards writing your own. So for like the affine texture warping, the vertex snapping, that kind of thing. But if you really just want to dive in and start playing around with the style, I cannot recommend the Haunted PSX render pipeline highly enough. It's fantastic. So yeah, if you're interested, if this is something you're like, I want to play around with that seems neat, bug me. You can DM me on Twitter or shoot me a Discord message or something. I'm at Ludodrome on Twitter, LUDODROME. And then I also included the Twitter accounts for Haunted PS1, Dread XP, and then E1M1 magazine, which is more retro shooter focused. But they all have Discords that are pretty active and are as much for developers or fans. So if you're interested, any one of those places, you can go in and go, how do I make a game? And people will jump in and help you, because a lot of people working in this were people who, have always wanted to make games and couldn't really until the tools and the kind of acceptance of this style had gotten to where it was. So, like at Haunted PS1, we love new people. We'll throw resources at you. So yeah, I don't really have that much more time, but that is the end of my presentation. So I don't know if we have like time for one question. Otherwise,
let's say I see one. Let's go for it. Cobertos asks, out of curiosity, how did you originally stumble upon the Haunted PS1 Discord?
A tweet. I literally just saw a tweet. Someone tweeted, "Oh yeah, I was hanging out in Haunted PS1." I was like, "Haunted PS1? That sounds like..." And I looked into it. I was like, "Dang, that's kind of like Sagebrush." That and at the time it was there were maybe I don't know, maybe under 20 people in the Discord or something like that. Maybe it was closer to 30 or 40. I don't remember exactly. And yeah, I just popped in and was like, "Hi, I'm the guy who made Sagebrush. I love that game." Which was cool because I wasn't expecting that response. And yeah, from there it just kind of ballooned.
Awesome. One more quick question.
Yeah.
Theon Smith asks, are you afraid of ghosts?
I am not afraid of ghosts. I am just like, if you put me in a dark alone, that will scare me. Otherwise, no, I don't really. I just, when I hear a noise in a dark house at night, I'm just like, oh, it must be like the furnace or something.
Very nice. Very, very good.
Yeah.
All right.
I am scared of ghost games. Games with ghosts are great. I love ghost games.
So you do like Phasmophobia and that type?
Oh, Phasmophobia is fantastic. I mean, yeah. Too many pixels, but otherwise, no, Fatal Frame is fantastic. No, I love some ghosts. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
did we ask about the Doom 3 question?
What's the Doom 3 question?
Okay, so Brant asks, with the PS1 aesthetic communities becoming so big, is the next big retro aesthetic going to be the Doom 3 style?
Honestly, I could see it. I finally got around to learning Substance Painter, Substance Designer, building materials that were not just photos that I slapped onto some UVs, basically like this year. And suddenly I was like, oh, I could make a game that had, yeah. And I think more people are kind of getting a handle on those tools. And yeah, I could absolutely see that being the next thing, is that like early normal mapping where everything looks like it's kind of covered in Vaseline kind of era of 3D. Yeah. That, I certainly have a fondness for that too, and I can see it happening.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Nate.
Yeah, I think that was an awesome presentation.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. And now I'm looking forward to seeing the students present.
All right, I think we're going to take a quick 5-10 minute break, and while we set everything up for the next team. But it was great having you, Nate.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we will see you later.
See ya.